All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to AMUX. Thank you so much for giving us a few minutes to let folks roll in, and thank you for being here. I am personally really excited to have Greg here with us today. Greg is first and foremost, Greg, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but first and foremost, Greg is a friend of mine, and I am very pleased to know Greg, and we've had a million good conversations about design and especially the types of things Greg's going to teach us about today. And we've had a lot of not only conversational design at Salesforce start to take root and expand and teach us a lot. But I think as you'll see, if you're not already convinced throughout the presentation today, this is a pretty big part of our careers in general, and is starting to seep into a lot of the different aspects that we work on already, and is kind of outside the bounds of conversation design as soon as it gets defined. So really excited to have Greg here, really excited to talk about this. Greg, any other superlatives or anything else I should add before you get started? Oh no, we can't hear you. Can you unmute for me?
Thank you. No, that's really kind of you, Cliff. I think you hit all the good stuff. Awesome.
Awesome.
All right, I'm gonna
we'll go ahead and get rolling when you're ready.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Second. All right, can folks see my slides?
Yep, things look great on my end. I'll take myself off video, but I'll be here, Greg. So if you need something or if you have questions, let me know. I'll hop on.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Cliff. And it's really exciting to be here. When Cliff mentioned to me that AMUX might be interested in something on conversation design, I obviously jumped at the opportunity. My background academically is in linguistics, so my sort of training is in how people use language in everyday contexts. Within the field of linguistics, there's a subdiscipline called sociolinguistics, which concerns itself with how to sort of analyze conversation and other types of discourse that are used by people in everyday social contexts. And that's really where I draw a lot of my foundation for conversation design, particularly when it comes to how to try to sort of leverage what we know about human interaction in a sociolinguistic sense, and use those as kind of like a design tool. So as to say, if we know that humans do X, Y, and Z conversationally to try and affect a particular change in an interaction, we can actively design for that, knowing that's sort of the pattern of conversational behavior. So that's really what I'm going to walk us through today, a little bit about how I've set up conversation design at Salesforce to grow, both as a discipline and a practice that's firmly rooted in sociolinguistic principle. So conversation as a sort of interaction mechanism, if you will, it's pretty easy to mess up. It's something that I think we often sort of take for granted, this idea that because we know how to have conversations as humans, that we therefore can easily design it. And I think this is something that any designer can relate to in their craft, whether they're a conversation designer or not. This idea that, if you're not careful, you can bake a lot of assumptions into the experience. And so all the, so I have 4 examples on screen right now. And each of these examples, I think very clearly highlights an experience that someone made and was doing conversation design, whether they knew it or not at the time. And they may have had the best intentions going in, but we still ended up with a frustrating, alienating, misleading, or overwhelming experience. So on the far left, we have a screenshot of a user who's interacting with Siri, where the user says, Siri, you need to do a better job of understanding me. Siri responds with noted. The user responds with, yeah, make a note of that. And then the app, Siri, essentially responds with a note that says of that. Now, from a sort of interaction perspective, we can look at this and think, okay, there's maybe some sarcasm going on from Siri. Is that what the product developer for Siri wanted? to come across in this interaction. Very likely, and because this is sort of a screenshot from many years ago, that's not the case. Because when it comes to creating an experience for your customer or your user, sarcasm is kind of a tough thing to operationalize as well as design for. And in this case, it seems more like a happy accident that Siri just misinterpreted the intent of the user and took make a note, which could be seen as a sort of colloquial phrase or idiom, so as to say, remember that, or keep that in mind, and really took it literally and created a note, an actual note artifact within the iOS. And so the misinterpretation of the intent there without any kind of opportunity to fix it, there's no opportunity to perform what's called conversational repair to sort of disambiguate the confusion and make a change. That leads to a frustrating experience. If we move one panel over to a user who's trying to speak to Alexa, the user's first language is German, and they have a German accent. And when speaking to Alexa, Alexa cannot understand what the user is saying. The user said, "Which writer wrote Westworld?" And the sort of exchange between the W sound and the V sound when it comes to sort of German and English can potentially lend itself to being confusing for Alexa if Alexa has not been trained on understanding that interchange of sounds. And that can be very alienating for a user. Particularly, I mean, this is AMUX, and so if you are a speaker of Southern US English, I'm sure many of you can relate to an experience with a voice assistant, for example, where perhaps they didn't understand you. And that can feel very alienating. You as a user should not have to change the way that you speak in order to get the product to react to or understand you in an appropriate manner. And if you have to, that can feel very alienating and quite a burden on the user side. The next panel over, we have a screenshot of a chatbot where the chatbot is saying, "I'm human," when it's not. And that's just straight up lying to your users, which we know is not a very, I mean, it's certainly not a good tactic for building trust. We never want to mislead our users conversationally, no matter how strong the conversation is, the conversation design, or the conversational experience. That's not going to, bode well if you're lying to the user. I think that, at least certainly several years ago, many folks within the sort of conversational AI realm thought like, oh, well, if it seems real, or if they think they're talking to a human, it's going to feel like a stronger experience because we made this thing as human as possible. But unfortunately, I think there's a little bit more nuance there than just saying, well, let's make the bot human. Rather, what I think it comes down to is conversation used to be a fundamentally human-only experience. And now the technology that we work with in conversational AI is advanced enough to allow machines to engage in that human behavior in a way that it simply just couldn't before. That doesn't necessarily mean make the technology human. It just means adhere to human expectations for this social behavior. And if we start to disambiguate what those expectations are, then we can make it very clear to the user, okay, you're talking to a machine, but it knows how to meet these rituals of conversation. That doesn't make it human, but it does mean that it can engage in a previously human exclusive behavior. The last panel on the screen has to do with overwhelming a user in chat. So, we all know with conversation, there are pauses that people take. You have to take a breath. Sometimes you leave space for another person to speak. And that, the length of a pause can vary. And a lot of that has to do with region and style. So for example, in California, many speakers of English practice a style where you leave a pause, and that is intended to cede the conversational floor to another person in the conversation so they can take a turn and speak. Whereas in maybe, say, New York, that pause is much shorter, to the point where maybe there's even conversational overlap, where if like, I'm not going to leave a pause for you to take your turn to speak. You're going to have to jump in, because that's an indication that the conversation is enthusiastic, engaged, exciting. That said, in chat, if you don't leave a natural pause in the conversation, because there's no real way to sort of do conversational overlap in chat because of the graphical interface, it's sort of, it's listed from top to bottom, which sort of creates this chronological order. You're going to need to leave space for the user to be able to read what it's saying. And so in the screenshot you're seeing here of a GIF, it sends like 6 messages all at once without any kind of pause for the user to take in turn by turn what it is they're saying. And it wouldn't be any better if you sent it in a big block of text, because that takes a lot to read too. So we need to consider, what is the pause structure in the conversation? How are we potentially increasing or slowing down the pace of the conversation with the length of the pause? And what does that do to the user interaction? In this case, because the pause length is 0 seconds, at best, it's rushing the experience. At worst, it makes the user feel overwhelmed, because it's like, okay, wait, you've sent all this text, I got to scroll up, and now I have to consume what it is that you've said. Alrighty. I think that when it comes to remediating these types of experiences that I just went through, there's an opportunity for us to lead with conversation design. We have an opportunity to standardize the language that we use in each interaction, so that way there's a sense of consistency. We can also standardize the tone of voice. Brand and brand identity comes through language very clearly in assets like marketing, right? Why should conversation be any different? It's an opportunity for you to not just have a conversation and build a relationship with your user, but it's also an opportunity to express the organization's brand through the language that you use. There's a very big difference between starting your conversation with hello versus how can I help you? You might want to get straight down to business if that's something that your user base is sort of used to conversationally. Interactional patterns. Does the bot take the first turn? Does the user take the first turn? Because if the user takes the first turn, what the bot says in response is going to be very different than if it were the opposite. If the bot takes the first turn, you may open with something like hello. If the user takes the first turn, they're likely going to state what it is that they want and what it is they're looking for. And if you respond to that with hello, that could potentially, hello, I'm such and such bot, and I'm here to help you today, that could come across as potentially sort of veering off course. And you may want to say, okay, all right, I see what you're saying. Let's do this. Sometimes the user just wants to dive in. So sort of setting up each of these mechanisms, what kind of language are you going to use? How does it relate to your company or your organization's brand? And what does the turn-taking structure look like? All of those can be standardized and should be consistent across the conversational experience, especially if you have multiple conversational solutions within your portfolio. Conversation design is also a great way to define when to use conversation versus when not to. So, as a linguist, I have to admit, conversation is not necessarily always the most efficient way of getting something done. You have to take turns with the other user. It may not be as efficient as a click. So the example I like to use is forms. So yes, you may want to ask users questions, several questions in a row to troubleshoot a thing, in which case, yes, that's quite helpful for conversation design. But if you're trying to say, just get a bunch of information from a user, that's, I don't think, a strong enough reason to use conversation design. Because if you're asking the user like 10 questions in a row that could easily be captured in a form, then why would you not use a form within the conversational experience and then move on to potentially solutioning that within the conversation, leveraging turn taking for going deeper on a subject rather than just collecting information from a user. The example that comes to mind for me is if you go to the doctor's office in the United States, particularly for the first time, what happens is they hand you a form to fill out a bunch of information so that way you can essentially get started with the doctor faster. They don't interview you and ask you all 30 questions or whatever, because that would take forever. It would take an hour. And so when we think about conversation design, particularly from a user experience perspective, we have to think about the efficiency element, particularly when it comes to B2B solutions. Working at Salesforce, we're a customer relationship management tool. And so having to think through how are we going to be as efficient as possible for a business use case is really important for us to say, okay, we're going to actually, we're going to capture the user's information in a form first, and then we're going to say, hey, this is how we're going to deal with your issue. Leveraging the best of what we know about graphical UX and marrying that with the strength of what conversation is helpful for. And then lastly, driving an ethically diverse mindset in conversationalizing your platform. So like I said earlier, with a German accent or with Southern US English as a variant of English within the United States, it's very important to make sure that your platform understands these different versions of English, because I think oftentimes we sort of assume that, oh, I speak this way and I have these, I have success having conversation in my everyday life. Therefore, the way that I have conversation is right. And as a linguist, I am sorry to burst that bubble. Actually, I'm not that sorry. I'm going to just burst the bubble. That there's no such thing as right. There's no right way to communicate. Just because you speak in a certain way doesn't make it better or more correct than somebody else's version of English. And if we don't include their version of English, that other person whose dialect or variant of English is different than mine, then all of a sudden that whole population of people who speaks English in that way won't be able to access your product. And it becomes less, well, I guess first and foremost, it becomes a usability issue and then an access issue, right? Like you have whole populations that potentially won't be able to use your product. You're leaving money on the table. It narrows your total addressable market. And so if you really want to be able to widen and open that aperture as much as possible, there needs to be a strategy around how we're going to bring those dialects and variants of English into the fold and train a language model to understand them, so that way the user doesn't have to do the heavy lifting. All right, so first things first, I get this a lot. People ask me, what is conversation design? In order to answer that question, we have to start with a baseline sort of definition of what is conversation. And conversation from a linguistic perspective is as follows. It's an exchange of language between two or more participants. So there has to be language involved somehow. That can be gesture. It can be, like obviously American Sign Language. You can have conversation that way. It can be sound, it can be text, but there has to be some sort of communication or exchange of language between at least two parties. If there aren't two people or two participants speaking or communicating within the interaction, it's not a conversation. It's a monologue or a talk like I'm giving now. There has to be this back and forth. And in doing so, in taking turns exchanging language back and forth, participants do so always toward accomplishing some kind of goal. Everything we say in conversation does something. You're persuading, you're complaining, you're explaining. And what I find quite often is that those goals tend to fall within the camps of transactional. So I want to get something done, or I want to, accomplish a task. Social, I want to sort of indicate the closeness or distance of a social group of some kind. So maybe we like the same kind of coffee, or maybe we like the same kind of football team, or maybe we like the same kind of pop star. And to sort of signify with what we say, like, oh, I love that. Oh, me too. That shows closeness socially, like, oh, we're part of a similar social group. Or a relationship goal, something to indicate to the other participant in the conversation we're close, or we're not as close as you think. And that could have everything to do with conversational style, such as, okay, we're talking at the same time versus we're not. Or it could have to do with power structures even within the conversation. Do you have more power than I do because you're my boss? So, we're related in this way, but we're not that close, kind of a thing. All of those things are indicated with what we say and how we say it. And conversation design is fundamentally the practice of designing interaction flows, strategizing forms of language, like specifically what is said and how it's said, to build a natural conversation between a user and a system. And so technically the field of conversation design, I think a lot of people say, oh, conversation design is really new. By this definition, it's actually been around for at least 40 years. If we think about things like IVR. So like, for example, if you're dialing in over the phone, press 1 for sales, press 2 for service, that's IVR. That is a system tree by which you can navigate through sort of, this architecture to determine how you want to get to the service that you want. That is probably the earliest form of conversation design. Thinking through, this is a voice experience. There are things that are being said. There's no graphical interface to hold the information in memory. So you have to keep the utterances short so that way the user can remember it. You have to keep the option short because realistically a user can't remember more than 3 at once. And there's like a turn-taking mechanism by which the user can at least press a button and indicate a response to move the conversation forward. I think nowadays, certainly, we have technological developments such as large language models like GPT-3 that allow us to generate language using AI. It allows us to understand free-form text and free-form speech using AI. And that has, I think, sort of revolutionized folks' thoughts on what conversation design is, because we have a lot more technological power at our fingertips. It allows us to build deeper conversations where we can take multiple turns with open-ended text in a way that we just couldn't before. And conversation design is essentially approaching that systematically and thinking through, okay, how are we going to use, like, what are the steps of the interaction to get us towards, say, a transactional goal where the opening piece is hello and the end piece is thanks, you fulfilled my intent, goodbye. And what exactly is the bot going to say in order to facilitate getting there step by step from point A to point B? And then finally, how do we render that in a graphical experience? Now, a lot of questions that I get around conversation design have to do with, well, we have the graphical experience and we have the language experience. Is it conversational UI or conversation design? And a lot of times they kind of get conflated. And so in order to separate those out, the way I like to explain it is conversational UI is inherently graphical. And it's extremely important because when we're thinking about chat, there has to be a way to organize the language graphically in a space such that a user can make sense of it. It's where the language lives. And so I purposely included on this screen a screenshot or a GIF of a bot where there's no text involved. It's just sort of a wireframe, right? And it shows, okay, there's messages that get sent back and forth. The message from potentially the bot comes from the left. The message from me comes from the right. We as users have sort of been socialized, particularly through things like text messaging and iMessage, on that sort of UI, on that organization of chat. That's including things like threading, messaging, loading notifications, slash commands, if you're familiar with Slack. All of those are ways to organize the interaction visually in a space. Once we have that, then we know, okay, how are we going to put the language design, the conversational experience in that UI? So conversation design is inherently linguistic compared to conversational UI, which is inherently graphical. So for conversation design, the things that you're thinking about, rather than how the language is organized in space visually, you're thinking more about the turn taking. Who's taking the first turn? How many turns are that participant going to take? Pausing and pacing, like I mentioned earlier, discourse markers. So I like to talk about discourse markers because they're often words that we get told to throw out in our conversation because many consider them to be filler words. So if you've ever taken a speech class or a rhetoric class, they very likely told you, oh, don't start your utterances or what you're saying with oh, or well, or or those little tiny words, while often they get dismissed as filler words, actually have a very big role in conversation. You may not want to say them during a speech, but in conversation, we naturally use them because they show cohesion of discourse in a conversation. So if I say, oh, actually, I wanted to do this. Oh is an indicator of, oh, I made this realization. Actually, I just did it, right? Oh, I made this realization. I have this realization and this understanding. It indicates an uptake of information. If I say, so I'm not going to talk about that. The so at the beginning of that sentence indicates I've done some analysis in my head, and as a result, I'm not going to do that. It represents, this is how this utterance or this sentence is related to everything else I've said before and what you've said before prior to what I'm saying right now. Another one, and those are discourse markers that get used to indicate to the other speaker cognition. I'm processing something right now, and so I'm going to fill this pause, this space, with a sound, or to indicate that I'm doing processing in my brain. I tend to sort of say that all discourse markers are highly encouraged in conversation design when you're one of the, you're designing for a bot, except for and because and those, like I said, indicate cognition, and machines are not capable of cognition. And so oftentimes when you use or in your conversation design, it comes across as creepy to the user because the user ideally knows they're talking to a machine because you didn't lie to them. And B, they know machines are not capable of cognition. They're not capable of thinking or feeling. And so to use those discourse markers, that ventures into the uncanny valley because of that sort of cognitive dissonance. All that to say, all the other discourse markers, well, so, but highly encourage them. If I had a nickel for every time someone said, oh, your designs, the conversation sounds so natural, it's really mostly discourse markers. Conversational style, so that has very much to do with voice and tone, what it is that you're trying to communicate in terms of enthusiasm or respect and deference, and that's going to vary depending on the conversational style of your user base. So like I said, showing enthusiasm in California is going to be, in that sort of variant of English, is going to be very different than showing enthusiasm in, say, New York City, where in California you're going to sort of leave a pause, but you compensate and show enthusiasm with sort of a rise in pitch or an exclamation of some kind. Whereas in New York, you show enthusiasm by constantly overlapping in the conversation. It may be very different in terms of how you show enthusiasm in the South. So really thinking through, what is that voice and tone? How am I expressing the conversational style? And what are we doing in the language? Maybe we're dialing up the pacing, maybe we're dialing it down, maybe we're using all caps, maybe we're using emojis, whatever it is, have a strategy for how you're going about building that style. Gartner and other research firms have endorsed conversation design as a way for enterprise to see success with their conversational tools. Fundamentally, I think this is a really good sign that within the market, more and more, credible institutions are citing the need for a strategic approach to the language experience of conversation. That it's not just writing, that it's not just interaction design, it's a confluence of a handful of these skills that we bring to bear upon the interaction, and that having consistency across the board leads to success. So every pause, every inflection or tone, if you're doing voice, every emoji, all of those things carry meaning, and they can change the course of your interaction entirely. So you need to be purposeful about it. Where many organizations get lost are that they don't have a distinction between the conversational UI and the conversation design. They sort of conflate the graphical and the linguistic to the point where everything sort of gets muddled and there's no rigor across either. A lack of linguistic diversity on staff. So, I've talked a lot about different variants and varieties of English. One thing that I have been purposeful about at Salesforce is making sure that those varieties of English are represented on my staff by native speakers. So like as a linguist, I have an understanding of the linguistic patterns and structure of African American English, but I'm not a native speaker of African American English, but I do want to make sure that among our customer base, speakers of African American English are recognized and understood by the system, meaning that the data, the language data that we collect includes African American English. And so I hired someone on my staff, essentially, who was a native speaker of African American English, who can help us identify what are the characteristics we need to look for in that variation of English. How do we make sure that those characteristics are represented in the model? How do we make sure that we don't produce those characteristics, because the bot that we're creating represents a large tech company that ostensibly operates mostly in white spaces. And so if it were to use African American English, it comes across as appropriative. So having someone who is a native speaker of that variant of English or of that language, if you're designing for a bot in another language, is highly important. A lot of teams get very theoretical, so don't get me wrong, I love linguistics. I do. Huge fan, devoted a lot of my life to studying linguistics, but at the end of the day, I work for a business, and the business needs to make money. And I've seen many teams sort of spend a lot of their time discussing, well, are we going to use complementary schismogenesis, or are we going to use politeness theory? And I'm like, who cares? We don't yes, we need to have our foot rooted, at least one foot rooted in a sense of theory and foundation, but we can't spend all of our time mired in that theory. We have to move on to what it is that we're actually building in the product. That said, I've also seen companies that have absolutely no rigor around language whatsoever, where they're like, well, hey, I'm a white man who likes to mountain bike from Mountain View, California. And so the way I have conversation, I'm successful. I'm a successful person. I'm really good at conversation. So I must have the right way of having conversation. So let's just build what I think. And it's like, yeah, no, assumption city. Don't do that. Let's be rigorous about checking our assumptions about language, questioning, why do we believe this is quote unquote right? Is it even right? Or is it just a variation? Is that the variation we're going to base our experience off of? How do we account for other variations that we're not thinking of? And what does that do to the customer or the user base? The way that I've sort of set things up at Salesforce is I've created a conversation design team that is central. So we have a huge product ecosystem, and the team that I lead matrixes itself out to these different product areas so as to create consistency at the outset. So that way, any team who's working with my team at Salesforce, whether it's the marketing cloud or the sales cloud, we're creating a conversational experience that is similar in both spaces. So that way, if there's a customer who has both products, they don't have to change their expectations about the interaction and how they're going to have a conversation with Salesforce in order to do it. We don't want marketing cloud to say howdy and sales cloud to say, hey, hello. There needs to be some consistency, or we don't want Service Cloud to start with hello, how are you, and potentially Sales Cloud to start with what do you want. We want to have a consistency in terms of both the language and the interaction patterns across the board. We want, and particularly for me, when it comes to equity and linguistic representation, I often find that, and that's honestly what led me to being willing to lead the team at Salesforce in the first place. Oftentimes, companies who are making conversational products, they tend to lose this first. They tend to say, oh yeah, diversity inclusion, but we got to move fast. So let's, we'll take care of that later. It's on the roadmap. I'm not a fan of that. And I was like, I'm not going to have that happen at Salesforce either. So making sure that we protect that throughout the entire product lifecycle, even when we're moving quickly, standardizing our quality control across the board, and acting as a force multiplier for other clouds. When it comes to engaging conversation design, really we encourage folks to engage our team early. That's something that I think everyone, this sort of flow chart that we have here, this is going to be familiar with everybody in the audience. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but the details are going to look a little different. So, instead of using Figma and creating a visual experience, we're going to probably use our bot builder to create a prototype to evoke to our audience and our stakeholders, this is exactly what the turn taking would potentially look like. But the rest of it is pretty much similar to what you would expect from UX. Really quickly, I'm going to take us through what I consider to be the 5 must-knows of conversation design. I know that I've taken us through a lot so far, but I think that these 5 pieces are, I think, the easiest to keep in mind when you're new to conversation design and starting out. So the first, like I mentioned, is to start with turn taking. Again, conversation is all about that back and forth. And so you need to consider, is turn taking the best interaction format for accomplishing the task that you're trying to help the user accomplish? Sometimes the answer to that is no. So, as experts of graphical UX design, make sure to keep that in mind. Like, we don't want to, they're going to potentially be stakeholders who are going to want to throw out the entire playbook for UX and say, well, like, this is conversation, we should make it all conversational. And my response to that is often like, no, not everything. Like, you use a calendar picker. Don't ask them 3 questions to find out the date, the time, and the place. Like, just use a calendar picker, please. Like, you can do it in 2 clicks. But troubleshooting, like, okay, so what's wrong? Can you describe this thing? Did you turn this on? Did it work, etc.? That is really great for conversation because you can go deep on a particular subject area. Check your language bias. So the way that you communicate, the way that you have conversation, like, sorry, but that's not the right way to have conversation. It's just a way to have conversation. And think through how it is that you're going to set a baseline conversationally, and what are the assumptions about language that you're building into that? How do you account for them? So a lot of folks might sometimes say, like, well, we need to use proper spelling. Well, linguistically speaking, spelling isn't real. It's not a thing. It's just something we invented to represent how we talk, but it's not an accurate representation of how we talk. So, if you're overly fixating on, like, well, the user needs to say YOU to the bot to indicate you, as opposed to just the letter U, then now all of a sudden anyone who uses just the letter U, they're not going to be understood by the bot. So, or, same thing with, I'm not sure what you might refer to as a fizzy drink that you drink out of a cup or a can if you open it. Some folks call it soda, some folks call it pop, some folks call it Coke, some people call it a soft drink. Who's right? I mean, there's going to be indication depending on where you're from. Oh, this is the right way to refer to that kind of drink. But again, I want to say that's just a way to refer to that drink. The bot needs to be able to understand all the ways because you don't want to lose that business with your customer. Picking a conversational style. So like I said, like, do you want to be a little bit more in the direction of what linguist Deborah Tannen calls high considerateness, or the conversational style where you leave a pause for the other person to talk, and that's considered polite? Or do you want to be a little bit more high involvement, which is, if you want to show enthusiasm in conversation, the polite way to do it is to overlap and talk with me at the same time. Are you going to show enthusiasm with emojis? Are you going to show respect with a period at the end of your sentence? Are you always going to use a period at the end of your sentence in chat? All of these things, all of these features of text-based chat, for example, or even voice, they change the dynamic or the feeling or the nuance of the conversation at hand. So pick a conversational style, make sure that it aligns with the brand of your organization, and then write playbook and the guidelines for when to deviate and when to stay and how to stay on style versus also how to deviate. Be action driven. So like I said, conversation is all about doing things. We're not just talking about stuff. A lot of times folks will say topic, topic, topic. And I'm like, yeah, that doesn't help anybody. Like, we can't just say sales. Okay, we're gonna, the bot's gonna do sales. Well, what is it gonna do? Is it gonna sell a thing? Is it going to help a customer learn a thing? Is it going to identify a lead, generate a lead, qualify a lead? Start with a verb. Optimize for buttons and an information architecture with a set of actions and intents that start with a verb to make it very clear to you and to the user, what is it that we're doing here? Are you connecting the user to a salesperson? Are you helping them look up a white paper? Are you helping them report an issue or check the status of an issue? Are you helping them set a password, change a password? file for a lost password. All of those things are different actions, and you're going to do them differently. And ultimately, your user is coming to you to do something. So start with verb. And then lastly, have a reason for all things language. So you have to be very purposeful about every punctuation mark, every word, everything you say in conversation could always be said in another way. And if you didn't say it in that other way, there's a reason for it. There's a reason why you said it the way that you did. I could say, hey, I've got an issue. Can you help? As opposed to like, hello, I have a problem. Can you please assist me? Those are two different ways of saying it. One of them's a little bit stiffer. One of them's a little bit more casual. How is that going to affect the interaction if the bot says it? The screenshot that we have here is the user says, hey, I've got an issue. Can you help? And the bot says, okay, 2 exclamation points, thumbs up emoji. I can totally help you. Peace sign with your fingers. Tell me about your issue, upside down, happy face. The emojis, the extra exclamation points, the emphasis with the word totally, which is also kind of a casual word, all of those things project enthusiasm in the conversation. And then the user responds with, don't act so excited. I have an issue here. I have a problem. I'm very likely to be frustrated. Why are you so happy? Like, you shouldn't be happy that I have a problem. So think through every time you put in any kind of aspect of language into the conversation, you have to be able to defend it as a designer. Well, I put a period here because I wanted to create emphasis, or I wanted to show respect toward the user because they're likely to be mad here. Or I put in an exclamation point because I want to show enthusiasm, show to the user, we're excited to have your business. Or I said, okay, let's get started, as opposed to, okay, I'm going to do that for you, because let's frames it as we're doing this together, as opposed to you're kind of off on your own and I'm going to go do this thing. It creates more closeness with the user. So everything you put in your conversation should have a reason. This is your sort of tear sheet, so feel free to take screenshots and whatnot, and I'll leave us here for Q&A.
Thanks, Greg. The questions that came in seem to be mostly about whether folks would be able to go back and watch this later. So
Sure.
As best we can, we're going to try to work that out and make sure we get that uploaded. In lieu of some other questions, and folks, if you have them, it sounds like Greg is open to answering your questions, which is great. Forgot to ask at the beginning. So feel free to send them in now using the Q&A feature in Zoom if you'd like. Otherwise, Greg, let me ask some kind of starter questions, like kind of common things that I hear, and see if we can kickstart this a little bit. First of all, let's say that I'm a designer. I'll try to pretend. Let's say I'm a designer, okay, and I am. My curiosity is very piqued by what you're talking about. Whether it was the idea of information architecture, sort of having a new type of container or a way to look at it, or whether it was down to the linguistics and making sure I'm inclusive of how people talk and how they interact and all that stuff. So something got piqued. What's your recommendation for my sort of next step as a designer? Like, where should I go to get more in-depth information, or learn more, or get plugged into conversation design as part of the industry? Like, what would you say to someone who wants to go further on this?
Totally. So a few things come to mind. I think if you want to go deeper in terms of conversation design as a discipline and a craft, there's a book that I recommend called Conversations with Things by Diana Diable and Rebecca Evanhoe, which is a very, very, very thorough volume that encapsulates a lot of what we've developed and a lot of the advancements in the field over the last several years. So I highly recommend that book. It covers both chat and voice, and I think it also covers multimodal conversation design. So I think it's a really great sort of handbook to have at least on hand, if not read in full depth. If you want to learn more about conversational style and linguistic stuff that I talked about, Deborah Tannen, the linguist who I mentioned around conversational style, has a book for general audiences on conversational style linguistics called That's Not What I Meant. Highly recommend that book. I reference it regularly. I have it open over here next to me on my desk. Very, very, very strong reference and way to, with lots of real world examples to sort of show this is how conversational style works. If you want to sort of go even deeper and get like trained in conversation design, the Conversation Design Institute based out of Amsterdam has certifications that you can pursue. So you can take a lot of online courses and then pursue a full-blown certification in conversation design. And I highly recommend them as well. Let's see, Salesforce, we do have a Trailhead on conversation design. So Trailhead is our free online learning platform. And so you can, sign up and create an account for free and just type in conversation design, and the Trailhead that I worked on will pop out.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot to check into. And I just want to reinforce as well for everybody, Trailhead that Greg just mentioned, if that's something you get value out of, that's not something we make money or get kudos for sending you towards. Like it's a really helpful thing that we've been cranking out of Salesforce. So I just want to be really clear on that, because I know Salesforce is pretty rough sometimes when you sign up for something. You might get some phone calls asking if you'd like to spend $1 million. No, these are just really helpful ways for you to learn things, and it's the team who works on it is awesome. Greg, can I funnel you a few more questions? Several have come
Yeah, of
in
course.
while we've been asking. All right, awesome. All right, we're going to do our best to, we'll prioritize based on when these questions rolled in, and we'll see what we can get to in 10 minutes, but keep sending them in. Thank you so much. So from Brittany, she asked, how much does conversational design overlap with content strategy? And how do content strategists and designers work together in conversational design?
So I think there's overlap in the sense of there's a lot of shared skills. So for example, thinking very critically about language, thinking very critically about pacing, right? Like a lot of my experience of working with content strategists is timing. When are we going to put out a piece of content at and when, and how is it going to have the most impact? Where is it going to live? All of those things I think lend themselves to conversation design as well. It's just happening at potentially a much faster pace because it's happening within seconds as opposed to potentially, a longer timeline. And so I think that if you sort of have that sort of frame in mind around conversation is similar content, we're just taking it to a much, much more micro level in terms of the turn-taking exchange, but that ability to zoom out and sort of see holistically across the entire interaction, where it is that you're trying to shape and move the interaction or the user toward a particular goal of some kind, that is, I think, very related to content strategy and content design as well. So there's definitely shared strategies there.
For sure. And I'll just add a little editorializing myself. I think content writing and conversation design are partners in that they are extremely unappreciated and yet critically important aspects of our user experiences, in things that we tend as an industry, I think, to underfund and underappreciate. So that's really awesome to get that conversation going as well.
Thanks.
Okay, so yeah. Thank you, Greg. So let's see. Gina asked, this is a cool one. So how do we integrate a brand persona into a chatbot conversation? I love the conciseness of that question. I think there's probably a lot to explore there, but what do you think, Greg?
Yeah, honestly, the way that we approached it at Salesforce, because Salesforce is a very strong brand, and it's very distinct with the cartoons and the very sort of, like happy, punchy sort of voice and tone, but also like serious in a little bit more muted within the product. And so our first step was to talk to marketing. We called up marketing. We were like, somebody explain to us exactly what the voice and tone guidelines of Salesforce are. And that's what I would recommend if you're doing conversation design in your organization. Leverage what already exists. You very likely have a marketing team because marketing gets funded, and they very likely have some sort of guideline as to what to do and what not to do, what is on brand and what is not, and how. And then from there, you can develop your own sort of system persona or system personality guidelines for your work for conversation design, and then have it checked by that same team. Hey, so this is what I'm thinking works conversationally. What do you think? Is it on brand? Is it off brand? What should we change? What should we do in this situation? Those are, I think, the easiest way to get started on that front.
Awesome. I'd love to drill in and ask like one extra question
Yeah.
on that, because I think this is an interesting bit. So, Greg, you talked a little bit about this in your talk as well, especially when it
Mhm.
comes to oh, it's early, so I'm losing my words. But
All
just
good.
the different the different not only languages, but also variations of all the languages that people
Yeah.
speak. I guess I'm curious. How do you think about the kind of intersection of brand, voice, and tone with the need to support multiple languages? So, for instance, like
Yeah.
it's pretty easy if you're going to be an extremely American-based company to introduce in your voice and tone, like gadzooks, something went wrong, and be like
Yes.
super playful or whatever. But like as soon as you need to translate that into Japanese, what does that mean?
Right.
And how how do you balance brand with clarity of communication? I'm
Yeah.
just curious if you have any thoughts on that area, or if you've seen it done well, or anything to help people think about serving international audiences, especially.
Yeah. I mean, how do I say this? Like, I hesitate to say that we do it well, but our process, at least what's working for us right now, is very similar. Like, I did a conversation design for one of our bot templates. It got localized into Japanese, and I know Japanese, so I was like, "Ooh, I wonder how it turned out." And I looked in Japanese, and I was horrified. I was like, "Oh no, that I would never say that." And so the way that I tried to approach it now, and the way that I've instructed my designers to do so, is when we hand over the designs, the bot itself, as well as any piece of text that goes into the chatbot, has to be documented within a separate document for our content team. And in that document, I've asked the designers to add a specific section called design notes, where utterance by utterance, the designer writes out at least something explaining what is their goal with what they're saying and how they're saying it. So that way the person who's doing the localization can take that into mind. Because I can say, like, I'm not a translator or a localizer, but when I do switch from English to Japanese, it's not about translating word for word. It's about trying to evoke that that feeling or evoke that sentiment through what I'm saying. And so rather than saying gadzooks and like literally translate that into Japanese, I would probably put in design notes saying, like, we're trying to demonstrate extreme enthusiasm here because we want the user to be really understanding that we're happy that they're our customer. That would go in my design notes, and then maybe it would get localized as something a little bit more familiar in that language. And so as you scale with multiple languages, the design notes, I think, really help for your localizer to get a sense of what is it that you're trying to do with this language, rather than them taking a guess at what you're trying to do and potentially even translating it directly.
Excellent, thank you. I knew you would have extra little nuggets on that bit that folks might not know to ask you for. Okay, got
Awesome.
another one. This is great, and I think it flows well from what we were just talking about. So
Mhm.
Kathy asked, from a tactical perspective, do efforts at inclusion and diversity mean that a single bot script that kind of resonates with everyone is deployed, or are there subtle variations in what that bot says based on geography, etc.? And so just tacking on a layer, I think this is probably clear for you, Greg, but it sounds like Kathy's kind of asking, is there sort of like almost an internal like workflow diagram where, in an effort to be inclusive and support diverse languages and variations and all that, that we sort of have all these options that the bot runs through to address it? Or is there a more generic sort of universal way to approach inclusion and diversity that somehow just sort of works?
So the way that I think about that is I sort of conceptualize designing the conversational experience in two directions. There's the input, what we're hearing or consuming from the user, and then the output, what the bot is saying to them. And I tend to sort of frame this as we should be able to handle all and as many variations and dialects of English or whatever language as we can on the input side. And on the output side, we pick, and I hesitate to use the word standard because people think there's a standard English and that's not a thing, but we pick a baseline of how the bot is going to communicate, so as to not potentially run the risk of being culturally appropriative. So we have to think very critically about your organization and the bot representing that organization. Who does your organization represent? Because if your organization doesn't operate in spaces or represent or do things on behalf of or help particular social groups, then having your bot be a representative of that organization and use language from those social groups that organization doesn't operate in is going to come across as disingenuous. So I think, you can stick to, okay, this is how our brand voice and tone works. We operate in these spaces. This is how we're going to talk. And I think eventually we'll get to a point where, like, if you scale and you can create multiple bots with different conversational styles, different variants of English, you can give the user the choice to switch over into that voice and tone. Kind of like how Alexa, you can change voices. Same thing with a chatbot, except you wouldn't necessarily want that to be the default, because you could users aren't ready for that yet. You could potentially come across as rude and appropriative if you come across, or if you begin that way, but you should always be able to understand them.
Awesome. Fantastic answer, Greg. Thank you. And just an additional, and Kathy, thank you for that question. That was a really, really good question, especially for us to end on. And I just want to encourage everyone again. I'm almost a little bashful about it because Greg's on the call, but like, Greg has really introduced me personally and a number of other people I work with to conversational design, not only as a means to do things like bots and chats well, but also, like, me and Greg talk often about, like, it's not just the bot. Conversational design is a lot wider than that, and has a lot of implications on the way that we design beyond just, making a form-based interaction a bit better. So I want to encourage everyone as well, if anything here piques your interest, and I'm betting something did, dive into the different aspects of it and allow yourself to remember that it's not just a bot or something like that, but this is a big part of how we interact with systems, and it's going to continue to be that way going forward. All right, I see some enthusiastic head nodding from Greg, so I feel really
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Cliff.
Yeah. Okay, Greg. Well, this has been fantastic. We're at time here. There are a couple of leftover questions. I'll see if I can get Greg to answer these, and we can maybe pass them along asynchronously in Slack or something like that. Otherwise, thank you everyone so much for joining us this morning at AMUX. This has been Greg Bennett talking about conversational design, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.